My son looked me in the eye and told me he needed a loan to buy a house for his new family. He begged me for the money, claiming he wanted to build a future. So I sold the only thing I had left of my late wife, her land, and gave him every cent. 6 months later, I received a letter telling me I wasn't invited to his wedding because my cane would ruin the aesthetic of his gilded estate. My name is Jim Vance. I am 72 years old. And to understand what happened, we have to go back to the morning the mail arrived. The mail carrier, a young man named Davis, who drives with his elbow hanging out the window regardless of the season, pulled up to the curb at 11 a.m. sharp. I respect that about him. In a world where contracts are treated like suggestions and on time is a fluid concept, the rhythmic squeal of his brakes is the only reliable clock I have left. I watched him from the front window, standing behind the sheer curtains Elena had hung 3 years before the cancer took her. The fabric was dusting now, gray at the edges, but I hadn't the heart, or perhaps the courage, to take them down. Davis shoved a handful of paper into the black metal box at the end of the driveway, flipped the red flag down, and accelerated away. The engine noise faded, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I took my time walking to the door. My left hip, the one that predicts rain better than the weatherman, gave a dull throb. Mobility issues, that's what the doctors call it. I call it 72 years of gravity and concrete. I put on my slippers, the leather ones with the hard soles, and walked out into the morning chill. The air smelled of wet asphalt and impending autumn.
The haul was standard. The electric bill, higher than it should be for a house occupied by one man who sits in the dark half the evening. A flyer for gutter cleaning from a company that probably hires undocumented kids and pays them in cash. And then, at the bottom of the stack, something different. It was an envelope. Thick. Heavy. The kind of paper you don't buy at the office supply store. You order it from a printer who charges by the grain. Cream stock, slightly textured like the skin of an expensive fruit. It had weight to it, a physical gravity that made the electric bill feel like tissue paper. I knew what it was before I turned it over. The wedding. Robert had been vague about the details for months. Every time we spoke, he was finalizing the logistics or coordinating with the planner. Corporate speak. He uses it like a shield. When a man talks about logistics regarding his own marriage, he's usually trying to hide the price tag or the guest list. I brought the stack inside, bypassing the hallway table where the junk mail goes to die, and walked straight to the kitchen. I sat at the head of the oak table. The wood was cool under my forearms. This was where Elena used to sit on Sunday mornings, polishing the silver service for hours, humming some tune she'd picked up from the radio, the smell of ammonia and lemon polish hanging in the air like a fog. She polished that silver for a future she thought we were building. She polished it for Robert. I placed the cream envelope on the center of the table. It sat there, distinct and arrogant. I ran my thumb over the return address, the gilded estate. No names, just the venue. I used my pocket knife to slit the seal, a clean cut. I dislike tearing paper. It shows a lack of discipline. I expected an invitation. I expected gold foil script, an RSVP card with a choice between steak and salmon, and a request for my presence to give away the only son I had. What I pulled out was a single sheet of folded stationery, typed, not handwritten. Dear Dad. The salutation was centered, rigid. I put on my reading glasses, the wire-rimmed ones I used for drafting blueprints back when my hands were steady enough to draw lines that didn't waver. Jenna and I are so excited for the big day. It's coming up fast. I skipped the pleasantries. I've read enough inspection reports to know that the first paragraph is always fluff. The structural failure is always buried in the middle. We've been working closely with the venue coordinators at the Gilded Estate to ensure everything is perfect. Unfortunately, due to strict historical preservation codes, the venue has rigorous capacity limits and accessibility restrictions that we weren't initially aware of. I stopped reading. The silence in the kitchen deepened. It pressed against my eardrums. Accessibility restrictions. I looked down at my cane leaning against the table leg. I looked at the coffee cup I'd washed by hand that morning. I read on. Given your recent mobility issues and the uneven terrain of the estate grounds, we feel it would be unfair to put you in a position of discomfort or risk. It's going to be a standing heavy event, very high energy, and we want you to be safe.
We think it's best if we celebrate with you privately after we get back from the honeymoon. We'll bring pictures. We know you understand. It's just the circumstances. Love, Robert. I folded the letter. I folded it perfectly along the original crease, then smoothed it flat with the palm of my hand. The paper felt cold, devoid of the human touch. Circumstances. It's a coward's word. It's a word used by men who want to frame their choices as inevitabilities. I looked around the kitchen. The sun was hitting the dust motes dancing over the stove. I saw the empty chair where Elena should have been. If she were here, she would be weeping. She would be calling him, her voice trembling, asking what we had done wrong, begging to be included. She would have offered to sit in the back, to not use the cane, to be invisible if that's what it took to see her son married. But Elena is gone, and I am not a man who begs. Robert didn't write this because of my hip. I walked 3 miles last week to the hardware store because the truck battery died. I built the deck this house sits on. I know how to navigate uneven terrain. No. This wasn't about safety. This was about aesthetics. I pictured the website I hadn't seen yet, but I knew existed. I pictured the woman, Jenna. I'd met her twice. She had a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that looked like it was practiced in a mirror. To them, an old man with a cane, a man who wears suits that are 20 years out of style and talks about the price of lumber, is an encumbrance. I am a detail that clashes with the gilded estate. I am a reminder of the blue-colored dirt they are trying to wash off with champagne. We'll bring pictures, the letter said, like I was a shut-in, like I was an invalid to be placated with a souvenir from a life I financed but wasn't allowed to enter. I felt a sensation in my chest, but it wasn't the heat of anger. Anger is a flash fire. It burns hot and dies fast. This was colder. This was the feeling of wet concrete setting in a mold. It was hardening. I picked up the envelope and the letter. I didn't crumble them. I didn't throw them in the trash. I walked to the hallway, my mobility issues barely registering as I moved with a sudden terrifying clarity. I went to the study and opened the filing cabinet. The metal drawer slid open with a sound like a pistol being racked. I dropped the cream envelope into the folder marked Family, Correspondence. It landed next to his college acceptance letter, next to the cards he made me in grade school with macaroni glued to construction paper. He hadn't just closed the door on me. He had changed the locks. But Robert had forgotten one thing. He had forgotten who built the house he was trying to lock me out of. He had forgotten that before you put up the drywall, you have to inspect the foundation. And if the foundation is rotten, you don't paint over it. You tear it out. I closed the cabinet. The latch clicked. It sounded final. The engine of my 2004 Silverado has a tick in the lifters that I've been meaning to fix for 3 years. But today, the rhythmic click, click, click was the only conversation I wanted. I drove out past the city limits, where the asphalt turns from smooth blacktop to that gray, cracked aggregate the county uses when they think no one is watching. I was heading for the county line, Section 4, Plot B. For 40 years, that designation meant a dense thicket of sugar maples and a creek that ran clear even in August. It was Elena's land. Her father, a man who came home from the mines looking like a shadow puppet made of coal dust, had bought those 10 acres one pay packet at a time. He didn't trust banks, and he didn't trust stocks. He trusted dirt. They can't print more of it, he used to tell me, tapping his temple with a finger missing the nail. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder. The gravel crunched loudly, a sound like bones breaking. I cut the engine. The silence that rushed in wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, filled with the distant grinding roar of heavy machinery. I stepped out. The air didn't smell like pine needles and damp earth anymore. It smelled of raw diesel exhaust and overturned clay. The maples were gone. All of them. In their place was a desolate expanse of red mud, churned into a slurry by the recent rains. The land looked less like a construction site and more like a battlefield where the losing side had been dragged away. Tire tracks from excavators cut deep, winding scars across the property, pooling with brown water. Bright orange survey stakes stuck out of the ground at odd angles, like arrows in a dead beast. I walked to the edge of the property line, stopping at the barbed wire fence that was now slack and rusting. 6 months ago, this view had been a wall of green. 6 months ago, I still owned the deed. I remembered the Sunday afternoon Robert had come over. He didn't sit down. He paced the living room rug, wearing a pair of Italian loafers that probably cost more than my first car. He was agitated, vibrating with that specific frequency of modern greed that disguises itself as ambition. "It's about leverage, Dad," he had said, using his hands to chop the air. "Jenna and I were looking at this colonial in Brentwood, top-tier school district, appreciation potential is through the roof. But the market is hot. We need a substantial down payment to be competitive." He talked about dynasty. He talked about generational wealth. He used words like equity vehicle and asset liquidity. I sat in my armchair, watching him. I saw a boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee, now trying to sound like a titan of industry. I knew he didn't have the cash. He had the degree, the job title, the leased BMW, but he didn't have the foundation. He was all facade. "I need a bridge, Dad," he'd said, finally stopping his pacing to look at me. "Just to get us in the door. I'll pay it back. You know I'm good for it." Elena would have given him the money before he finished the sentence. She would have sold the jewelry off her neck. But Elena wasn't there to soften the blow. It was just me, and I knew the value of $1 because I knew how hard it was to earn one. But he was my son, and in my world the code is simple. You support your blood. If the load-bearing wall is buckling, you shore it up. You don't ask if the wall deserves it. I had looked at him, then at the picture of his mother on the mantel. "The land," I had said. "The acreage?" Robert had wrinkled his nose. "Dad, that's dead capital. It's just sitting there. If you liquidate that—"
Liquidate, make it water, make it flow. I sold it 2 weeks later to a developer from the city who had plans for luxury condos. I signed the deed with a hand that felt numb. I took the check, $150,000 after taxes, and I handed it to Robert. I stood there now, gripping the cold wire of the fence. I watched a yellow bulldozer in the distance. It dropped its blade and shoved a massive pile of topsoil into a ravine. That soil had taken 1,000 years to form. It was gone in 4 seconds. I had traded Elena's history for Robert's future. I had traded the permanent for the temporary. The wind picked up, cutting through my flannel shirt. I squinted at the mud pit. $150,000. I thought about the letter on my kitchen table. Strict capacity limits, mobility issues. The math didn't balance. If Robert had bought the house in Brentwood, he would have closed by now. He would be sending me photos of the keys, of the empty rooms, of the sold sign. That's what people do when they succeed. They broadcast it. Robert, especially, never missed a chance to preen. But there had been no photos of a house, just photos of engagement parties, trips to vineyards, dinners where the portions were small and the plates were square. I watched the bulldozer reverse, its backup alarm beeping in a monotonous, mocking rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. A sick feeling began to coil in my gut. It wasn't the grief of selling the land. I had made my peace with that the day I signed the check. This was something sharper. It was the instinct of an engineer looking at a set of blueprints and realizing the measurements are off by an inch. If the measurements are off at the bottom, the building collapses at the top. I had liquidated the land to build him a foundation, but looking at the mud and thinking about the capacity limits of his wedding, I started to wonder where the concrete had actually gone. I turned back to the truck. I wiped a spot of red mud off my boot with a thumb. The land was gone, the money was gone, and I wasn't invited to the wedding. I climbed into the cab and slammed the door. The echo inside felt small, contained. I needed to see exactly what I had bought. I started the engine. I wasn't going home. I was going to find a computer. I don't like looking through digital windows, but sometimes that's where the rats hide. I walked next door. Mrs. Gable's lawn is kept short, but she plants impatiens in the shade that invariably die by August. I knocked on the frame of her screen door. She answered with a dish towel in her hand and a look of mild surprise. I didn't waste time with weather talk. I told her I needed to borrow Leo and his computer for 10 minutes. She nodded, wiping her hands, likely assuming I needed help printing a shipping label or resetting a password. Leo is 16. His room in the basement smells of stale corn chips, aerosol body spray, and the ozone hum of overheating electronics. He sat in a gaming chair that looked like the cockpit of a fighter jet, surrounded by 3 monitors. "Mr. Vance," he said, pulling off his headset. "What's up?" "I need to find a website, Leo. I don't have the patience for the search engines on my phone." He spun the chair around, his fingers hovering over a mechanical keyboard that clicked like a bag of marbles being shaken. "Shoot." I handed him the cream envelope. "Search for the names. Robert Vance,
Jenna Sterling, The Gilded Estate, Leo typed. The speed was unnecessary, performative. A grid of images flooded the center screen. Jackpot, the boy said. Looks like a wedding site. You want me to open it? Yes. The screen washed out in a bath of soft whites and gold leaf script. It wasn't a web page, it was a digital shrine. A banner image took up the entire monitor. It was Robert and the woman, Jenna. I leaned in, my hand gripping the back of Leo's chair. Robert was wearing a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. Midnight blue, shawl collar, silk facing. I know fabric. I know the drape of quality wool. That suit cost more than the roof replacement I did on the garage last fall. He was holding a flute of champagne, looking at her with an expression of adoring submission. And Jenna, she was beautiful in the way a polished marble statue is beautiful, cold, hard, and expensive. She wore a white dress that seemed to be made of lace and air. Her blonde hair was swept back, revealing a neck that probably held pearls on other days. But it was her smile that held me. It was wide, showing perfect veneer white teeth. It didn't reach her eyes. It was a predator's smile, a shark scenting blood in the water. Fancy, Leo muttered, scrolling down. Keep going, I said. My voice sounded hollow in the small room. We passed sections titled The Proposal, staged on a cliffside, professional photographer clearly present, and The Bridal Party, 12 groomsmen, 12 bridesmaids. Stop, I commanded. The heading read, Our Story. I read the text. It was written in that breathless third-person narrative that marketing agencies use to sell luxury condos. Robert and Jenna met at a summit in Aspen, a power couple from the start. They bonded over their shared drive and ambition. Jenna, a senior brand strategist, and Robert, a self-made entrepreneur who built his portfolio from the ground up, knew instantly that they were matches in both love and business. Self-made. The words hit me like a bag of wet cement dropped from a second story. Self-made. I stared at the pixels. I thought of the mud pit on the county line. I thought of the check for $150,000. I thought of the hours I spent under the hood of his first car, the tuition checks I signed with grease-stained fingers, the years of overtime I worked so he wouldn't have to take student loans. He had erased me. To these people, to Jenna, to her family, to the world viewing this website, Robert had sprung fully formed from the head of Zeus, armed with capital and genius. I was an unsightly footnote, a structural flaw he had plastered over. Leo, I said, click on the venue. The screen changed. The Gilded Estate. It was a sprawling mansion, something out of a period drama. Manicured hedges, a fountain the size of a swimming pool, a ballroom with crystal chandeliers that looked like frozen explosions. Capacity? 350 guests. The number was listed right there, in the FAQ section under parking. Strict capacity limits, that's what the letter had said. Mobility issues. I looked at the photos of the grounds. Paved walkways, ramps, elevators. It was more accessible than the local hospital. Whoa, Leo said, whistling low. That place is nuts. My cousin got married at the VFW hall. This looks like where Batman lives. It does, I said. I looked at the date counter in the corner of the screen. 3 days, 14 hours, 22 minutes until we say I do. 3 days. I felt a sudden clarity. It was the feeling you get when the smoke clears and you see exactly where the fire started. Robert wasn't protecting me from the terrain. He was protecting the narrative. He was protecting the lie. An old man with calloused hands and a limp didn't fit the brand of a self-made entrepreneur. I was the evidence that his foundation was borrowed. "Is that your son?" Leo asked, looking up at me. "He looks successful." "He looks expensive," I corrected. I straightened up. My hip popped, a dry, sharp sound. "Thank you, Leo. That's all I needed." "You want me to print the directions?" he asked, hovering the mouse over the location tab. "No," I said. "I won't be needing directions." I walked out of the basement, up the stairs, and into the afternoon light. It was blindingly bright. The world looked different than it had 10 minutes ago. Before, I was a hurt father. Now, I was an auditor. I walked back to my house. The silence of the kitchen was no longer suffocating, it was focused. I had work to do. Robert wanted to be a self-made man. He wanted to be an independent entity, unburdened by the past. I went to the study. I needed to check the paperwork. Because if a man claims he built the house himself, he better be able to show the receipts for the lumber. And I held all the receipts.
My study is the only room in the house where the air feels distinct, separated from the rest of the world by a solid oak door and 3 inches of insulation. It smells of cedar shavings, dried tobacco from a pipe I haven't smoked in 15 years, and the sharp acidic tang of old paper. This is my archive. This is where the truth lives, organized by year and subject, safe from the revisionist history of the internet. I closed the door behind me. The latch clicked, a solid mechanical sound that signaled a shift in operations. I wasn't a father in here. I was an engineer. I was an auditor. I walked to the filing cabinet in the corner. It's a drab olive-green metal beast I salvaged from a government surplus auction in the 90s. It weighs as much as a small car and is fireproof for 2 hours at 1700 degrees. I keep the key on a separate ring attached to a loop on my belt. I inserted the key. The tumblers aligned with a gritty friction that traveled up my arm. Click. I pulled the second drawer. It slid open on greased bearings with a heavy rolling thud, exhaling a breath of cool, stale air. My fingers walked over the tabs. Insurance, medical, pension, property tax. I stopped at Robert, promissory. The folder was manila, crisp and unbent. I pulled it out and laid it on the blotter of my desk. I sat down, turning on the brass banker's lamp. The pool of yellow light illuminated the folder like an interrogation subject.
I opened it. There was only one document inside, 3 pages stapled in the top left corner. When Robert had asked for the money, standing in my living room with his Italian loafers and his desperate eyes, he had expected a check and a hug. He had expected the Bank of Dad to operate on sentiment. But I spent 40 years calculating load limits and stress factors. I know that money, like water, will find the path of least resistance and leak away if you don't build a containment vessel. I hadn't just given him the money. I had drafted a formal promissory note. I adjusted my glasses, wiping a smudge of dust from the lens with the tail of my flannel shirt. I looked at the document. I had typed it myself on the typewriter I keep for envelopes. The font was Courier, blocky and severe. Promissory note and loan agreement. Principal amount, $150,000. Date, March 14, 2025. I skipped the preamble. I knew the preamble. I wrote it to be gentle. 0 interest, repayment deferment for 24 months to allow them to get settled. It was generous. It was the kind of loan you give to family. But generosity requires boundaries. I ran my finger down to the section marked Use of Proceeds. Clause 4, Allocation of Funds. The text was clear. I read it aloud to the empty room, my voice flat and raspy. The borrower agrees that the entirety of the loan principal, $150,000, shall be utilized exclusively for the down payment and associated closing costs of a primary residential property. Any use of funds for purposes other than the acquisition of real estate, including but not limited to consumer debt repayment, vehicle purchase, lifestyle expenses, or travel, shall constitute a material default. Exclusively. It is a hard word. It leaves no room for interpretation. It leaves no room for market volatility or parking the funds. I leaned back in the creaking chair, the paper resting in my hands. I remembered the day he signed it. He had been so eager. He had seen the check sitting on the corner of the table, the check funded by the sale of his mother's maple grove, and his eyes had been glued to it. I had pushed the contract toward him first. "Just a formality, Rob," I had said. "Standard practice. Keeps everything clean." "Sure, Dad, sure," he had said, laughing a breathless, nervous laugh. He had grabbed my pen. He didn't read it. He didn't even scan the headers. He just wanted the money. He flipped to the last page, signed his name, and reached for the check in one fluid motion. I looked at that signature now, at the bottom of page 3. Robert J. Vance. It was hasty, a scrawl of black ink that looked like a tangled fishing line. It was the signature of a man who thought he was above the fine print. It was the signature of a man who thought his father was a soft touch, an old relic who wouldn't remember the terms.
He thought the contract was a prop. He was wrong. I looked at the date again, 6 months ago. If he had bought a house, I would have the address. I would have the deed transfer records. Instead, I had a letter about capacity limits and a website showing a wedding that cost as much as a small subdivision. He hadn't bought a house. He had taken the liquidity I provided, the sweat equity of his grandfather, the legacy of his mother, and he had poured it into a party. He was wearing the money. He was drinking the money. He was using the money to impress people who would never know my name. He was in material default. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, displacing the grief. Grief is hot and messy. This was different. This was the cold calculation of a structural engineer realizing a beam has failed inspection. When a beam fails, you don't mourn it, you condemn it. I flipped to Clause 7, acceleration. In the event of a material default, the lender reserves the right to declare the full amount of the principal immediately due and payable. The lender may exercise any and all legal rights to recover said funds, including the right of offset or clawback from holding institutions.
I ran my thumb over the word clawback. It's a violent word. It sounds like an animal defending itself. I wasn't just an excluded father anymore. I was a creditor. And Robert wasn't just a rude son. He was a bad investment. I closed the folder. The stapled pages made a crisp snap. I took the folder with me. I didn't put it back in the cabinet. This wasn't for storage anymore. This was active. I reached for the telephone on the desk, a heavy, corded landline that I keep because cell service is spotty in the study, and because I like the weight of the receiver. I needed to make a call. Not to the bank, not yet. First, I had to confirm the breach. I had to give him one last chance to tell the truth. It's a courtesy. You give the structure one last stress test before you condemn it. I dialed his number. I know it by heart, though he rarely answers. I waited for the connection, listening to the hollow ring on the other end, staring at the folder on my desk. Robert, promissory. Let's see how he handles the audit.
The phone rang 4 times, a long mechanical trill that echoed against the cedar paneling of my study. I held the receiver tight against my ear, listening to the emptiness of the connection. On the 5th ring, just as the voicemail automation was about to kick in, the line opened. "Dad?" Robert's voice was breathless. It wasn't the breathlessness of exertion. It was the sharp, shallow pant of someone looking over their shoulder. Behind him, I could hear the distinct, chaotic roar of a crowded room, the clinking and high-quality glass, the swell of string music, and the low, murmuring current of 100 conversations. He was at a welcome party. A rehearsal dinner, perhaps. "Dad, hey, is everything okay? I can barely hear you." He was whispering, likely cupping his hand over his cell phone, stepping into a corridor or a bathroom to hide the fact that he was speaking to the man who wasn't invited. "I am fine, Robert," I said. My voice was level. I imagined a spirit level resting on my tongue, the bubble dead center between the lines. "I received your letter." "Oh, right." A pause. The background noise dipped, then swelled again. "Look, Dad, I know it's not ideal, but the venue, you know, they're tyrants about the fire codes. We just want you safe." He waited for me to absolve him. He waited for the "it's okay, son" that I had given him when he failed algebra, when he crashed the station wagon, when he quit his first job. I didn't give it to him.
"I am calling about the house," I said. The silence on his end was immediate. It wasn't the silence of a bad connection. It was the vacuum of panic. The house?" he stammered. "The closing," I clarified. "It has been 6 months. My records indicate you should be in the final stages of acquisition. I need the address for the insurance rider on the loan." "Right, the house," he cleared his throat. I heard a door close on his end, muffling the music. "Well, it's a complicated market right now, Dad. You haven't seen the inventory squeeze." "I read the papers, Robert." "It's unprecedented," he rushed on, his voice gaining that slick plastic quality he adopts when he's selling something. "We decided that rushing into a closing right now would be fiscally irresponsible. There's too much volatility. The interest rates are fluctuating wildly." "So you haven't bought a house?" "Not yet," he said. "We're pivoting. We're holding the capital. We're parking the funds in a high-yield holding position until the right opportunity arises. It's a strategic delay. We want to maximize the equity potential."
Parking the funds, strategic delay, equity potential, words made of smoke.
The agreement, I said, staring at the signature on the desk in front of me, was for a down payment. Clause 4, specific allocation. I know, he snapped, a flash of irritation breaking through the corporate veneer. And we will use it for that, eventually. It's just liquid right now. It's part of a larger portfolio strategy. He was lying. I didn't need a polygraph. I could hear it in the cadence of his breath. I could hear it in the way his pitch rose at the end of the sentence. He wasn't parking the funds. He was burning them. He was standing in a room paid for with my retirement, drinking wine paid for with his mother's maples, telling me about strategy. Robert, I said, are the funds intact? Of course. Dad, look, I have to go. Jenna's father is making a toast. I can't be missing. Robert, we'll talk after the honeymoon, okay? We'll sit down and go over all the numbers. I promise. I really have to run. He was panting again. He wanted off the hook. He wanted to go back to the fantasy where he was a self-made man and I didn't exist. Love you, Dad, he said. It came out fast, automatic, like a sneeze. Click.
The line went dead. The drone of the dial tone replaced him. I sat there for a long moment, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the hum of the disconnect. Love you. He used the words like a punctuation mark, like a period to end a sentence he didn't want to write. I slowly lowered the phone to the cradle. It clicked into place with a heavy, final sound. I looked at the promissory note. If he had told me the truth, if he had said, "Dad, we used the money for the wedding because we wanted to be royalty for a day and we're sorry," I might have just been disappointed. I might have let it slide, absorbed the loss as the cost of having a fool for a son. But he lied. He treated me like a shareholder to be managed, not a father to be respected. He looked me in the eye, even over the phone, and tried to sell me a bridge that he had already burned. The politeness was dead. The benefit of the doubt was gone. I picked up the folder. I stood up. My hip ached, a sharp reminder of the mobility issues that allegedly kept me from the wedding. But pain is just a signal. It tells you the machine is working. I checked my watch. 2:15 p.m. The bank was open for another 2 hours. I walked out of the study. I went to the closet in the master bedroom. I pushed aside the flannel shirts and the windbreakers. I reached for the plastic garment bag at the back. It was time to put on a suit. I removed the suit from the garment bag. It was charcoal wool, double-vented, tailored in a year when men still wore cuffs on their trousers. It smelled of cedar blocks and the faint chemical ghost of dry cleaning fluid. I dressed slowly. The white shirt was starched stiff enough to stand on its own. The tie was a dark maroon silk, tied in a Windsor knot that I pulled tight until I felt the pressure against my throat. It wasn't a fashion statement. It was armor. I drove to the bank in silence. The First National branch on Main Street is a brick fortress built in the 50s, with brass railings and a floor of checkered terrazzo that echoes when you walk on it. I've banked here since 1985. They hold my mortgage papers, my retirement accounts, and the safety deposit box where Elena's diamond earrings sit in velvet darkness. The air inside was cool and smelled of circulating dust and nickels. I walked past the tellers, young women who looked at me with the polite indifference reserved for the elderly, and headed straight for the glass-walled office in the back. Mr. Halloway saw me coming. He is a man of soft edges, with a handshake that feels like gripping a bag of flour, and a smile that he wears like a uniform. He stood up, smoothing his tie. "Mr. Vance," he said, ushering me in, "to what do I owe the pleasure? We weren't expecting you until the quarterly review." I sat in the leather chair opposite his desk. It let out a long, wheezing sigh. "This isn't a social call, Arthur." He blinked, his smile faltering just a fraction. He sat down, clasping his hands on the mahogany desk. "Of course. How is everything? How is the garden? I remember you saying the tomatoes were coming in early." "The garden is fine," I said. My voice was steady, the low rumble of a heavy engine idling. "But the weeds are choking the roses. And when the weeds get too high, you have to pull them out by the root." Holloway chuckled nervously. "I suppose that's true. Gardening is a constant battle." "It is." I placed the manila folder on the desk. I didn't toss it. I laid it down with precision, aligning the edge of the folder with the edge of his blotter. "I need you to look at this."
Holloway opened the folder. He adjusted his rimless glasses. He scanned the promissory note. He read the header, the principal amount, and then his eyes drifted down to the signatures. "A loan to your son," he said, nodding. "Very generous. We see these family arrangements often. Is there a problem with the filing?" "Turn to Clause 4, I said, "and Clause 7.
He flipped the page. He read in silence. I watched his eyes move back and forth. I saw the moment he understood. His eyebrows pulled together. "Specific allocation," he murmured. "Primary residence. He didn't buy a house, Arthur," I said. "He is using the funds to pay for a wedding at the Gilded Estate. He is using capital designated for real estate to pay for catering and flowers." Holloway looked up. "I see. Well, that is certainly disappointing, Mr. Vance. Family disputes over money can be very messy, but I'm not sure what the bank's role is here. This is a private contract. The wire transfer originated here," I said, "from my account to his. The funds were conditional based on this contract. The condition has not been met. It is a fraudulent inducement." I leaned forward. The leather of my coat creaked. "I am exercising the clawback provision. I want the transfer flagged for fraud review. I want the funds frozen and recalled." Holloway paled. The color drained from his face, leaving him the shade of old paste. He pushed the folder away slightly, as if it were hot. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "to recall a wire, especially a domestic one that cleared months ago, that is an extreme measure. It triggers federal scrutiny. It freezes the recipient's accounts entirely during the investigation. It's incredibly aggressive."
He looked at me, pleading for me to be the nice old man who grows tomatoes. He wanted the grandfather, not the engineer. "Aggressive," I repeated. The word tasted metallic. I thought of the maples being dozed into the mud. I thought of the immobility issues. I thought of the self-made man preening on a website while his father sat in an empty kitchen. "Taking an old man's life savings under false pretenses is aggressive, Arthur," I said. "Lying to your father to fund a vanity project is aggressive. Theft is aggressive." I tapped the paper with my index finger, one hard tap. "I am simply correcting a structural failure. Initiate the recall." Holloway stared at me. He looked at the contract. He looked at the determined set of my jaw. He realized there was no negotiation here. I wasn't asking for permission. I was giving an instruction. "I'll need to call the fraud department," he said weakly. "It will take some time." "I have time," I said, settling back into the chair. "I'll wait."
The glass wall of Holloway's office is thick, designed to dampen sound, but it doesn't block out the sight of a man dismantling someone's life over the telephone. I watched Holloway turn his swivy chair away from me, his shoulders hunched as he spoke into the receiver. He was using his crisis voice, low, urgent, and deferential. He was talking to the fraud department, a group of people who likely sit in a windowless room in Delaware and view human tragedy as a series of algorithm flags. I sat perfectly still. The leather of the guest chair was warm from my own body heat. On the wall, a generic round clock with a black rim ticked off the seconds. Click, click, click. It was the only sound in the room, louder than the hum of the air conditioning. It sounded like a metronome setting the tempo for a demolition. I rested my hands on my knees. My knuckles were swollen, the arthritis flaring up from the rain that was threatening to break outside. I looked at them, hands that had tied rebar, poured footings, and signed tuition checks. Hands that had held Robert when he was small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. The waiting gave me time to think. It dragged up a memory I hadn't touched in 20 years. Robert was 12. He had a temper then, a flash paper fuse that he'd inherited from my side of the family. He'd been playing baseball in the cul-de-sac, angry about a strikeout, and he'd sent a fastball through Mr. Henderson's greenhouse window. It was a stupid, careless act of rage. I remembered standing in the driveway, looking at the shattered glass twinkling in the grass like diamonds. Robert was crying, terrified, not because of what he'd done, but because of what it would cost.
"You have to pay for it, Dad," he had pleaded, tugging at my sleeve. "Mr. Henderson is going to kill me. Just write him a check, please." I could have written the check. It was $200. It wouldn't have broken us. But I looked at the boy, and I saw the entitlement taking root, a weed that needed pulling. "No," I had said. "But why?" he wailed.
Because you broke it, you fix it. I made him mow Henderson's lawn for the entire summer. Every Saturday, while his friends were at the pool, Robert was pushing that heavy Toro mower through the humidity, his face red, sweat stinging his eyes. He hated me every step of that summer. He told Elena I was a monster. He told me he wished I wasn't his father. But by August, he walked different. He looked people in the eye. He understood the weight of labor and the cost of negligence. Or so I thought. I looked at Holloway's back. He was nodding vigorously, though no one could see him. Robert was 32 now, but he was still the boy in the driveway, asking me to write a check to cover his mistakes. He wanted the glory of the self-made man without the sweat of the mower. He wanted the house money for a party, and he wanted me to stay silent in the corner while he spent it. He would hate me for this. The hate he felt at 12 would be a candle compared to the bonfire this would ignite. He would call me petty. He would call me vindictive. He would tell his new wife that I was a bitter old man trying to ruin his happiness. Let him.
A structural engineer doesn't care if the building likes the support beams. He cares if the building stands. If you pour the concrete wrong, if there are air pockets, if the mix is too wet, you don't patch it. You don't paint over it and hope for the best. You bring in the jackhammers, you tear it out down to the rebar, and you start over. It's loud, it's expensive, and it's messy, but it's the only way to ensure the roof doesn't cave in on your head 10 years later. I was bringing out the jackhammer. Holloway hung up the phone. He sat there for a moment, composing himself, before swiveling back to face me. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago. There was a sheen of perspiration on his upper lip. "It's done," Holloway said. His voice was thin. I didn't blink. Confirm the status. "The transfer has been flagged as fraudulent inducement or misappropriation of funds under the federal banking statutes," Holloway recited, reading from a notepad where he'd scribbled frantically. "Because the amount exceeds $10,000 and crossed state lines, it triggers an automatic freeze on the recipient account pending an investigation." "The recipient account," I said. "That would be his primary checking?" "Yes," Holloway said. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "And any linked accounts that showed transfer activity. The algorithm is comprehensive. It locks everything down to prevent the movement of the disputed assets. So his cards won't work." "No," Holloway said. "Debit, credit, wire transfers, it's a total freeze. He won't be able to buy a pack of gum until he provides proof that the funds were used in accordance with the promissory note." I nodded. It was a clean kill. "Mr. Vance," Holloway said, leaning forward, "you understand that once this machinery starts, it's hard to stop. The bank is legally obligated to investigate now, even if you call us tomorrow and say it was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," I interrupted. "It was a correction." Holloway looked at the file on his desk, then at me. He looked at my suit, my tie, the callus on my thumb. He seemed to realize that he was in the presence of something ancient and unyielding, something that didn't fit in his world of fluid assets and flexible morals. "He will be notified immediately," Holloway said softly, "when a transaction is declined." "Good." I stood up. My knees popped, but I ignored the pain. I reached over and took the empty folder. I left the promissory note with him. It was evidence now. "Thank you, Arthur," I said. "You've been very helpful." "I hope," Holloway trailed off, "I hope you know what you're doing, Mr. Vance. I'm teaching my son how to mow the lawn."
I turned and walked out of the office, across the terrazzo floor that clicked beneath my heels. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and out into the afternoon. The sky had turned a bruised purple. The storm was coming. I walked to my truck, unlocked the door, and climbed in. I checked the time. It was Thursday. The wedding was Saturday. The vendors would be demanding their final payments right about now. The caterer, the florist, the venue. They don't take IOUs. They take cash. And Robert Vance, the self-made entrepreneur, was about to find out that his liquidity had just evaporated. I sat there for a moment, watching the traffic pass on Main Street, people rushing to their jobs, to their homes, to their little debts and little victories. I felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. It wasn't satisfaction. It was just the feeling of a job done. I started the engine. The lifters ticked. I drove home to wait for the fallout. The air on the porch was thick, holding the moisture of the coming storm like a held breath. It was late Thursday afternoon.
The light was failing, turning the neighborhood into a grayscale photograph, draining the color from the hydrangeas and the parked cars. I sat on the porch swing. I hung it myself 20 years ago, bolting the chains into the structural joists of the overhang. It doesn't creak. It moves with a silent pendulum rhythm. In my hand, I held a red delicious apple. In the other, my pocket knife, a case trapper with a bone handle, the steel honed to a razor edge on an Arkansas stone. I placed the blade against the top of the fruit, just near the stem. I began to peel. The goal is always the same: one long, unbroken ribbon. It requires consistent pressure and a steady hand. If you cut too deep, you waste the fruit. If you cut too shallow, the skin snaps. It is a small discipline, but disciplines are what keep a man from falling apart when the world goes soft. 48 hours. That is the timeline. In the construction world, 48 hours before a ribbon cutting is when the inspectors come through. It's when the punch list is finalized. It's when you find out if the plumbing actually holds water or if you've just built a very expensive fountain in the basement. In the wedding industry, which is just construction with more tool and less integrity, 48 hours is the liquidity event.
I know how these contracts work. I read the fine print on the venue's website before I went to the bank. The gilded estate requires full settlement of all accounts prior to vendor load. The caterer needs the check to buy the filet mignon. The florist needs the balance to release the orchids from the cooler. The band needs their guarantee before they load the van. Right now, 300 miles away, the machinery of Robert's vanity project was grinding into gear, and someone, likely a venue coordinator with a clipboard and headset, was asking for a card. I turned the apple slowly against the blade. The red skin curled away, revealing the pale, wet flesh underneath, the smell of tart apple juice mixed with the ozone of the approaching rain. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the rhythm of the swing soothe the ache in my hip. I could see the scene in my mind as clearly as if I were reviewing security footage. Robert would be standing at the reception desk of the gilded estate. He would be wearing a polo shirt that costs $80 and a watch that costs $5,000. Jenna would be next to him, perhaps looking at flower arrangements, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath her was liquefying. The manager would smile, a tight service industry smile. "Mr. Vance, we just need to settle the final balance for the venue fee and the bar package before we begin the setup tomorrow. That will be—" I did the math in my head. The capacity limits letter implied a large affair, 350 guests, open bar, $45,000. Robert would smile back. He would reach into his wallet, the leather soft and imported. He would pull out the platinum card, the one linked to the account where he had parked the house money. He would hand it over with the casual arrogance of a man who believes money is a renewable resource. Beep, the machine would think. It would reach out through the digital ether looking for authorization. It would hit the wall I built in Mr. Holloway's office. Transaction denied. I opened my eyes. The apple peel was 6 inches long now, hanging in a perfect spiral. I imagined the pause. The manager would frown, tap the machine, maybe wipe the chip. "It seems to be declining, Mr. Vance. Perhaps a chip error." "Try it again," Robert would say, a laugh bubbling up, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Banks, right? Probably a travel flag." They would try again. Transaction denied. Then Robert would try the debit card, the one for the joint checking. Denied. Then the emergency card. Denied. The freeze Holloway initiated wasn't a surgical strike, it was a carpet bomb. When the fraud department flags an account for misappropriation of funds involving a 6-figure sum, they don't take chances. They lock the social security number. They lock the connected assets. They turn the digital identity into a ghost. Robert was currently standing in a marble foyer surrounded by staff who suddenly looked less like servants and more like bouncers, realizing that he had zero purchasing power. He couldn't pay the venue. He couldn't pay the florist. He probably couldn't even pay for the Uber back to his hotel. I sliced a wedge of the peeled apple and put it in my mouth. It was crisp, cold, and sweet. I chewed slowly. This was the cruelty of the lesson, I knew, to strand him there, in front of the woman he was trying to impress, in front of the in-laws who thought he was a tycoon. It was a public shaming. But shame is a powerful adhesive. It binds you to reality. Robert had spent his life floating on a cushion of my support, convinced he was flying. He needed to hit the ground to know the difference. He needed to understand that net worth isn't a number on a screen. It's what you own when the screen goes dark. And right now, he owned nothing, not even the suit on his back, effectively. The wind picked up, rattling the chain of the swing. A single dry leaf skittered across the porch floorboards with a sound like scratching fingernails. My phone lay on the small table beside me. It was face up. The screen was black. It hadn't rung yet.
He would be arguing right now. He would be on the phone with the bank's automated system, shouting "representative" into the receiver, while the venue manager tapped a pen against a clipboard. He would be sweating. He would be realizing that the technicality he ignored, Clause 4, Section B, was actually an iron bar across the door. Jenna would be watching. Her shark smile would be faltering. She would be looking at her self-made entrepreneur and seeing a man whose credit card just bounced on the most important weekend of her life. She would be doing her own calculations. If the money isn't there, what is he? I finished the apple. I tossed the core into the bushes for the birds. I wiped the blade of the knife on my pant leg, then folded it shut. Snap. The silence on the street was profound. No cars, no birds, just the heavy, low-pressure system pushing down on the roof. I stared at the phone. The first ripple of the shock wave was traveling 300 miles of fiber-optic cable. It was coming. I folded my hands over my stomach and waited. I had nowhere else to be. I wasn't invited, after all.
The storm I could smell earlier had moved closer. The sky was now the color of a bruised plum, low and heavy, pressing down on the rooftops of the neighborhood. The wind had died down, replaced by that static-charged stillness that makes the hair on your arms stand up. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled by thunder. On the small wicker table next to me, the phone sat face up. At 2:15 p.m. exactly, the screen lit up. It was a jarring, artificial blue light against the gray afternoon. The phone vibrated against the wicker, a buzzing sound like a trapped hornet. Bzz, bzz. I looked at the caller ID. Robert. I didn't reach for it. I didn't recoil. I simply watched the name flash, appearing and disappearing in rhythm with the vibration. 300 miles away, Robert was standing in a lobby that smelled of lilies and money, holding a piece of plastic that was now just a piece of plastic. He was likely smiling that tight, panicked smile, telling the manager, "One moment, let me just call my bank. I think I need to authorize the transaction." But he wasn't calling the bank. He was calling the source.
The phone rang for 45 seconds. That's a long time when you are watching it. It's enough time to peel a quarter of an apple. It's enough time to realize that the safety net you thought was there has been cut away. The ringing stopped. The screen went black. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. I picked up a second apple from the bowl I'd brought out. A Granny Smith this time. Green skin, hard flesh. Tart. I opened the blade of my case knife again. The steel made a soft snick. I waited. Panic is a process. It has stages. First is confusion, the belief that there is a mistake, a glitch in the system. Then comes the frantic attempt to correct it. Then, when the correction fails, the realization sets in. At 2:20 p.m., the phone lit up again. Robert. He was persistent. He was scared. I imagined him stepping away from the counter, turning his back on Jenna and the venue manager. He would be walking toward the glass doors, his thumb hovering over the dial button, sweat pricking at his hairline. He would be thinking, "Pick up, old man, pick up." He needed me to fix it. He needed the dad who fixed the broken window, the dad who fixed the transmission, the dad who fixed the tuition. He needed the structural engineer to come shore up the collapsing wall of his ego. But I wasn't the engineer today. I was the demolition crew.
I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I imagined my voice greeting him on the recording. Standard, flat, telling him to leave a message. A message I wouldn't listen to. A moment later, the phone chirped. A text message. I wiped my thumb on my trousers before touching the screen. Dad, bank error. Cards acting up. Need to talk ASAP. Call me. Bank error. I chuckled, a dry sound that didn't leave my throat. It is the universal excuse of the guilty. It is never, "I spent the money." It is never, "I violated the contract." It is always the system's fault. It is an error, a glitch, a misunderstanding. He was still lying. Even with the noose tightening, he couldn't admit he had kicked the chair out from under himself. He wanted to frame this as a technical difficulty, something we could solve with a phone call and a wire transfer override. He thought if he could just get me on the line, he could fast-talk me. He could use the emergency of the wedding to bypass the accountability of the loan. He didn't understand. The error wasn't in the bank. The error was in his character.
I sliced a wedge of the green apple. I placed it in my mouth. The juice was sharp, acidic. It made my jaw ache pleasantly. I chewed slowly, grinding the fruit down, savoring the resistance. The wind gusted, rattling the loose gutter on the garage. I'd need to fix that before winter. Then the phone rang a third time. I looked down, expecting to see Robert's name again. Unknown number. I frowned. I don't answer unknown numbers. Solicitors, scammers, people wanting to sell me solar panels or tell me my car warranty has expired. But then the screen shifted. The carrier's logic caught up at the data packet. A name appeared, likely pulled from a public database, or perhaps I had saved it once, long ago, and forgotten. Jenna Sterling. I stopped chewing. The fiancée. I stared at the device. I hadn't given her my number. Robert must have given it to her, or she had seized his phone, or she had looked it up in his contacts while he was hyperventilating in the men's room.
This was an escalation. This was the shark entering the water. If Robert was calling, it was to beg. If Jenna was calling, it was to negotiate, or to threaten. She would be using her project manager voice. She would be calm, assertive. She would say, "Hi, Dad. Can I call you Dad? We're having a little hiccup with the transfer, and Robert is so stressed. I just wanted to see if we could sort this out directly." She would try to charm the old man. She would think I was a senile obstacle, a rusty gate that just needed a little oil to swing open. She didn't know I was the one who welded the gate shut. I watched the phone vibrate. It moved an inch across the table, dancing towards the edge. I could pick it up. I could tell her. I could say, "The money was for a house, Jenna. Ask him about the maples. Ask him about the promissory note." It would destroy him instantly. She would look at him not as a victim of a banking error, but as a liar who had defrauded his own father. The wedding would not just be canceled, it would be incinerated. But I didn't pick up. I am an old man, after all. I have mobility issues. I am likely napping in my recliner, the hearing aid turned down, dreaming of days when my son was small and honest. Or perhaps I am in the garden, tending to the roses, too far away to hear the digital cry for help. That was the narrative they built. That was the box they put me in, the frail, incapable geriatric who couldn't be trusted with an invitation to the ball. Fine, I would live in the box. I watched the screen fade to black for the third time. I took another slice of apple. The storm was almost here. The first heavy drop of rain hit the porch railing like a bullet. Tap. Then another. Tap. I wasn't going to answer. Not yet. Let them sweat. Let them exhaust every credit card, every favor, every lie. Let them feel the absolute crushing weight of their own choices. I checked my watch. 2:35 p.m. The banks close at 5. The fraud department goes home. The weekend begins. If they didn't solve this in 2 hours, the freeze would last until Monday, and the wedding was Saturday. I leaned back in the swing, listening to the rain begin to drum against the roof. It was a soothing sound, the sound of washing things clean. I waited for the real storm to break.
The storm finally broke at 5 p.m., syncing perfectly with the closing of the bank vaults. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the aluminum siding of the house like 1,000 nervous fingers tapping on a desk. It was a heavy, cleansing rain, the kind that washes the oil off the driveway and forces everyone indoors. I sat in the kitchen, a mug of black tea cooling in my hands. The steam rose in a thin gray ribbon, twisting and vanishing into the air. The house was dark, save for the light over the stove. I prefer the dark. It helps you focus on the sound. And the sound was the phone. It had been vibrating on the counter for 3 hours, a relentless, frantic buzz, buzz, buzz. It was the sound of a trapped insect beating its wings against a jar. At 5:30 p.m. I decided it was time. The fraud department had gone home. The freeze was absolute. There was no override code, no manager to speak to, no negotiation to be had until Monday morning. The trap had snapped shut. I reached out and picked up the receiver. The plastic was warm. Hello? "Dad! Oh my God, Dad!" Robert's voice exploded into my ear. It was a sound I hadn't heard since he was 7 years old and had gotten separated from me at the state fair. A raw, high-pitched frequency of pure terror. But he wasn't 7. He was 32. And the background noise wasn't a fairground. It was the echoey, tiled acoustics of a bathroom or hallway where someone goes to hide. "Dad, listen to me," he gasped. He was hyperventilating. "Something is happening. The accounts, everything is dead. I tried the cards, I tried the wire, it's all flashing fraud. The venue manager. Jesus, Dad, he's talking about calling the sheriff if we don't settle the bill by 6. I took a sip of tea. It was bitter. I had steeped it too long. "Slow down, Robert," I said. My voice was low, devoid of the panic that was consuming him. It was the voice I used when I had to tell a client that their foundation was sinking. "What do you mean, dead? Frozen, locked. Holloway, I called the bank, but I couldn't get through to a person, just some emergency line. They said there's a federal hold, a clawback investigation." He said the word clawback like it was a foreign disease. "They're saying the funds were misappropriated," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Jenna's dad, Mr. Sterling, he's out there right now trying to put it on his Amex, but he's furious, Dad. He's asking me what kind of operation I'm running. He's asking if I'm insolvent. I look like a fraud. I look like a beggar." "You are insolvent, Robert," I said. The line went silent. The background noise, the distant sound of a door opening, a snippet of string music cut through. "What?" he whispered. "The funds," I said, speaking slowly, enunciating every consonant. "The $150,000. That capital was conditional." "Dad, what are you talking about?" "I visited Mr. Holloway today. I brought the promissory note. You signed it, Robert. March 14th, Clause 4, Section B." I could hear the gears turning in his head. I could hear the moment the realization hit him, heavy and cold as a wrecking ball. "You?" he choked out. "You did this?" "I did." "But why? Why would you do this? Today? Now?" His voice rose to a shriek, stripping away the polished baritone he practiced for his board meetings. "It's my wedding. You're ruining my life." "I am auditing your life," I corrected him. "You took money designated for a home, for a foundation, and you used it to throw a party you didn't want me to attend." That's what this is about?" He let out a hysterical, wet laugh. "Because of the invite? Dad, we told you, the capacity limits, the mobility issues. It wasn't personal." "Don't lie to me," I said. The command was sharp, cutting through his hysteria. "I saw the website, Robert. I saw the self-made entrepreneur. I saw the venue with the elevators and the ramps. You didn't exclude me because I can't walk. You excluded me because I don't fit the picture." He fell silent. The truth has a weight to it. You can't argue with gravity. "And the money," I went on. "You looked me in the eye and told me you were parking it. You told me you were waiting for the market to settle. You lied. You stole from your mother's legacy to buy champagne for people who don't know your middle name." "It's a loan," he screamed. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed the cash flow for the event. Once the bonus checks come in next quarter, if, when, maybe." I set the mug down on the table. Clink. "I don't deal in speculation, Robert. I deal in contracts, and you are in default." "It's a technicality," he roared. "You're destroying me over a goddamn technicality." "A load-bearing wall is a technicality until the roof collapses," I said. "Honesty is a technicality until you're caught. You tried to build a life on a lie. You tried to build a party on a foundation meant for a home. That is structurally unsound, so I pulled the permit." "Dad, please," he broke. The anger dissolved into weeping. It was a pathetic, gasping sound. "Jenna is going to leave me. Her father is going to ruin me in this town. Please, call Holloway. Tell him it's a mistake. I'll sign anything. I'll pay you double interest. Just fix it." He sounded like the 12-year-old boy in the driveway, staring at the broken window, terrified of the cost. He wanted me to take the checkbook and make the bad thing go away. He wanted the magic of the patriarch to shield him from the consequences of his own arrogance. I closed my eyes. I pictured Elena. I pictured the maples. I pictured the empty chair at the wedding I wasn't invited to.
"I can't fix it, Robert," I said. "The bank is closed. The investigation is automatic. It's out of my hands. You can call the emergency line. You can verify the funds." "I could," I said softly, "but I won't." "Dad!" "You wanted to be a self-made man," I said.
Here is your opportunity. Build your own way out of this. I hate you, he whispered. The venom was real this time. It wasn't the heat of the moment. It was the cold, hard hatred of a narcissist denied his supply. I will never forgive you for this. That is your choice, I said, just like the venue was yours. Dad! I pulled the phone away from my ear. I looked at it for a second. I could hear his tiny, tinny voice screaming my name, begging, threatening, bargaining with a god who had stopped listening. I placed the receiver back on the cradle. Click. The connection was severed. The screaming stopped. The kitchen was quiet again, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof. My hand was shaking, just a little, a tremor in the fingers. I looked at my hand. It was an old hand, spotted with age, scarred from years of working with steel and stone. It was a hand that had built things that lasted. Bridges, homes, families. And sometimes, to keep the structure safe, you have to tear down the rot. I picked up my tea. It was cold now. I drank it anyway. It tasted like rain and iron. I walked to the window and looked out at the storm. The streetlights were flickering. The power would probably go out soon. That was fine. I had candles. I had a flashlight. I was prepared. Robert was in the dark, 300 miles away, but I suspected he was finally beginning to see things clearly.
I didn't need to see the wreckage to know what the crash looked like. When a bridge fails, the physics are predictable. The tension snaps, the support gives way, and gravity does the rest. I heard the details 2 weeks later from my niece, Sarah. She's my sister's girl, a quiet thing with eyes that observe more than her mouth admits. She came over on a Tuesday, bringing a Tupperware of lasagna she claimed was leftover, but I knew was a peace offering. She sat at my kitchen table, picking at a loose thread on her sweater, looking everywhere but at me. "It was bad, Uncle Jim," she said softly. "I've never seen anything like it." I poured her a cup of coffee. The steam rose between us, a small fog of normalcy. "Tell me." She took a breath. The venue manager met them at the gate. He had 2 security guards with him. He told Robert that due to non-payment of contract, access was denied. Robert tried to argue. He was screaming, waving his phone around, saying it was a bank error, but the guards just crossed their arms. I nodded. I could picture it. The desperate flailing of a man whose credit had run out. "Jenna was in the limo," Sarah continued. "She wouldn't get out. Her father, Mr. Sterling, got out, though. He looked ready to kill someone. He asked Robert to show him the transfer confirmation on his banking app. And Robert couldn't unlock the app. It just kept showing that red account locked banner." Sarah took a sip of coffee, wincing as if the memory itself had a taste. "So where did they go?" I asked. "Centennial Park," she whispered. "The groomsmen made some calls. They found a pavilion that wasn't booked. Uncle Jim..." It was raining. The wind was blowing the tablecloths off the concrete picnic tables. They had to get takeout from a local Italian place because the caterer refused to deliver to a non-contracted site without cash up front. I stared at the wood grain of the table. A public park. Cold lasagna in aluminum trays. A bride in a $10,000 dress standing in the mud, surrounded by wet pigeons and confused joggers. The guests? Half of them left immediately, Sarah said. The important ones. The investors, the networking opportunities Robert wanted to impress. They just turned their cars around and drove back to the city. The ones who stayed, it was mostly family. We stood around shivering, no one made toasts. The illusion had shattered. Robert had spent years curating a facade of effortless wealth. He had built a wall of expensive suits, leased cars, and inflated job titles to keep the world, and me, at a distance. But wind and rain have a way of stripping the veneer.
"Mr. Sterling," Sarah said, her voice dropping lower. "He was shouting in the parking lot, loud. He called Robert a fraud. He said, 'You told me you were a partner. You told me you owned the land.' He said Robert was living on phantom capital." Phantom capital. A good term. It means load-bearing walls made of paper. "And Jenna?" I asked. Sarah looked down at her hands. She didn't look at him. She just sat on one of the benches, holding her dress up out of the puddles. She looked cold, not just physically. When Robert tried to talk to her, to explain, she just turned her back. She left with her parents before they even cut the cake. There wasn't a cake, actually. It never arrived. I leaned back in my chair. The chair creaked, a sound of solid, honest wood. The aftermath was swift.
In construction, when a project fails inspection this spectacularly, the permits are pulled immediately. Jenna filed for an annulment 3 days later. It wasn't a marriage, it was a merger that failed due diligence. Once she realized the self-made entrepreneur was actually a man with a frozen bank account and a father he'd tried to erase, the value of the stock plummeted to zero. Her devotion was tied to the asset column. When that column went red, she liquidated her position.
Robert is staying at a motel near the airport, Sarah added, finally looking me in the eye. He lost the apartment. Apparently the rent was auto-drafted from the same account. I know, I said. He looks terrible, Uncle Jim. He asked about you. Did he? He asked if you were happy. I looked out the window. The maples in the yard were turning color, the leaves shifting from green to a deep, bruised red. Happiness doesn't enter into it, Sarah, I said. It's about structural integrity. You can't live in a house built on sand. I just waited for the tide to come in. She nodded, though I don't think she fully understood. She saw a ruined wedding. I saw a necessary demolition. He's alone now, she said. He was always alone, I replied. He just had enough noise around him to pretend he wasn't. Sarah finished her coffee and left. The house was quiet again. I walked to the hallway and picked up the mail. There was a letter from the bank, a standard notification of the investigation status. It said the funds would be returned to the originating account pending the conclusion of the review, usually within 90 days. The money was coming back, the $150,000. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt the hollow, heavy exhaustion of a man who has had to shoot his own dog because it turned rabid. I had saved my money, but I had lost the last illusion of my son. But illusions are expensive to maintain. Reality, at least, is free. I put the letter on the desk. I had one more piece of business to attend to. The money was returning, and I knew exactly where it belonged. Not in a bank vault, not in a stock portfolio. It belonged in the dirt. The bank statement arrived in the second week of December. The envelope was standard business white, not cream, and it lacked the heavy grain of a wedding invitation. I opened it at the kitchen table with the same pocket knife I use for apples. Credit, plus $150,000. Memo, fraud reversal, funds restored. The number sat there, black ink on white paper, cold and unfeeling. It was the same amount that had destroyed my relationship with my son, the same amount that had exposed the cracks in his life, the same amount I had traded Elena's legacy for. It was back. The investigation was closed. Robert had been found in default, the transfer voided as a conditional gift based on fraudulent inducement. I didn't feel rich. I felt heavy. Money that has traveled through that much misery comes back with a weight to it. I folded the statement and put it in my pocket. I put on my coat, the heavy canvas Carhartt that cuts the wind, and walked out to the truck. The morning air was biting, smelling of snow that hadn't fallen yet. I drove out to the county line.
The road was quiet. The leaves were gone, leaving the trees looking like skeletal fingers scratching at the gray slate of the sky. I turned onto the gravel access road that led to Elena's plot. The coming soon luxury estates sign was still there, but it had fallen onto its face. The plywood was warping, the bright artist's rendering of happy couples and manicured lawns peeling away in damp strips. The market had turned. The interest rates that Robert had lied about parking money for had actually spiked, and the developer, a man who leveraged debt to buy dirt, had folded. The project stalled before they poured a single footing. I parked the truck. The engine ticked into silence. A new sign was staked near the road. Bank owned, for sale, commercial, residential. It leaned crookedly in the frozen mud. I stepped out. The ground was hard, crunching under my boots. The site was a wound. The bulldozers had stripped the topsoil, leaving a chaotic landscape of red clay ruts and frozen puddles. The wild maples were gone. The underbrush was gone. It looked like the surface of a dead planet. I walked the perimeter. I walked the lines I had walked with Elena 40 years ago, when we first paced out where the fence would go. I stopped near the center of the lot, where the old grove used to be. I kicked at a frozen clod of dirt. It shattered. The surface was ruined. It was ugly, scarred, and mishandled by men who wanted to turn a quick profit. But I'm an engineer. I know that surface damage is just cosmetic. I knelt down. My knees cracked, a sharp report in the cold air. I pulled a glove off and pressed my bare hand against the earth. It was freezing, but beneath the frost, the soil was still there.
The geology hadn't changed. The bedrock was still waiting. I thought about Robert. He was living in a rented room now, working a mid-level sales job, trying to rebuild from zero. He hadn't called. I didn't expect him to. He was learning the lesson I should have taught him years ago. You can't harvest what you didn't plant. I stood up, wiping the red dust from my hand. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I dialed the number on the for sale sign. The realtor answered on the second ring. He sounded bored, likely expecting another window shopper. "This is Jim Vance," I said. My voice was rough, like the gravel under my feet. "I'm standing on the lot at County Road 4, the foreclosure." "Oh, right," the realtor said, perking up. "Great potential there. Bit of a fixer-upper on the grading, but I know the land." I cut him off. "I used to own it." "Oh, Mr. Vance. I didn't realize. I want to buy it back."
There was a pause, the sound of papers shifting. "Well, the bank is looking to offload it quickly, but the price has actually gone up slightly due to the improvements the developer made to the access road. They're asking $170. I had sold it for $150. $20,000. That was the price of the lesson. That was the tax on my own stupidity for believing that money could buy my son a character he hadn't earned. "I'll pay it," I said. "Cash. Closing as soon as the title work clears." "Cash?" The realtor choked slightly. Okay. Yes, we can draw that up today." "Good." I hung up. I looked out over the desolate field. I had paid a premium. I had lost months. I had lost a son, perhaps permanently, but I had the land. I walked back to the truck. In the bed, under a tarp, I had a shovel. I wasn't going to use it today. The ground was too hard. But come spring, I would be back. I wasn't going to build a house. I wasn't going to build a luxury estate. I was going to the nursery in the next town over. I was going to order saplings. Sugar maples. They grow slowly. It takes 40 years for a sugar maple to reach maturity. I would be long dead before they offered any real shade. I would never see them as tall as the ones Elena loved. But that didn't matter. We live in a world of fast bamboo and shallow roots, things that shoot up overnight and fall over in the first wind. Robert was bamboo. The wedding was bamboo. I was going to plant trees. Trees that take their time. Trees that have to fight the dark and the cold to find their purchase. Trees that once they take hold can withstand the storm. I climbed into the truck and started the engine. The heater blew warm air against my face. I put the truck in gear and drove away, leaving the muddy field behind for the winter. It needed the rest. We both did.